want to talk about testing these Dead Sea Scrolls and all these ancient books real quick, and there are some good books and there are some bad books, but I mean, I guess we got to start somewhere, and the place I guess most of us start is what was the canonized scripture. And for me, when I would listen to the scriptures over and over and over again, I started to hear different books mentioned in the scriptures that didn't make it into the canon, and that was books like Enoch being directly quoted, and books like Jasher that were mentioned by name twice, and there are other books like that. So I mean, you start to test things like this, and I at one point was very I really wanted to know and understand what were all these councils, the Council of Nicaea or what Nicaea or whatever, who that decided which books made it into the canon and which didn't, and then you got the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and all these other works, and at one point it just kind of seemed overwhelming. I did look into a good number of books that were outside of the canon, but then it did get a little overwhelming, and I never completely finished my study on that. But now, you know, it's I suppose when you hear contradictions in doctrine is when all of a sudden you realize you need to take a step back and maybe finish that proving out work to test that book. Like, maybe something's going on with the translation and there is no contradiction, or maybe one writing is completely false and the other one is true, or maybe the writing isn't completely false, but there are just sections of it that have been tweaked by manipulative people adding things in to try and suit their doctrine. And so, you know, it's just a little concerning when you look at the Dead Sea Scroll collection, and right off the bat you're seeing that they have this hate doctrine to love your neighbor and hate your enemies, exactly like what the Pharisees had, and Yeshua debunked that doctrine in his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. He said, "You've heard it said," as opposed to "it is written." You've heard it said, "Love your neighbor, hate your enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemy." So, like, you know, if there's one false doctrine like that, I just advise us to be careful and to look into it and to not underestimate how much people will write to try and, propagate and prove out their doctrinal points. Don't ever underestimate how much somebody or some ancient people may write, and we need to make sure, just because it's anciently written, that we're not just giving them a free pass and saying, just because it's ancient, you don't have to be tested and we don't have to make sure everything lines up. And remember that the straight and the narrow path, I think, as I've been seeing over these years, there's one ditch, a big ditch on one side and a big ditch on the other. And the ditch on the one side is lawlessness at many different levels. And you got to look at that at fear and trembling. I don't care what level you are at, you've got to look at that with fear and trembling, because I can tell you there's still growing to do as far as the instructions of the Almighty are concerned. And I've just been so busy with the calendar, I haven't had to have time to address the other things that have been on my heart. But, like, you know, the Savior said not one jot and not one tittle will pass. And so we've got to remove that thought process from our doctrine that anything was done away with at the cross, I think, because nothing, according to the Savior, nothing was, not one jot, not one tittle would pass as a result of his death. Like, he took away the curse of the law, and maybe there are manifold other things that happened when he died, but you're putting words in his mouth when people say, that was fulfilled at the cross. the entire law was fulfilled at the cross. Well, the ceremonial law was fulfilled at the cross. The Sabbath law was fulfilled at the cross. The feast day laws were, they make these divisions, but Yeshua said not one jot, not one tittle. So it becomes I still hear that infiltrating, even among Torah people. They're slicing and dicing portions of the instructions and saying, yeah, Yeshua did away with that at the cross, and we need to remove that from our doctrine. I think, unless I'm missing something in the translation, we just need to be careful, and it becomes a thing of looking with very much fear and trembling to see if truly things can still be obeyed, or if they apply. And we'll talk more about that in another series. But like I was saying, the straight and the narrow, got on a tangent there. Lawlessness on one side at many different levels, and don't ignore that side, because it happens all the way to the top. All along the straight and the narrow road, you've got the lawless one trying to present lawlessness all the way. So you got to be careful. The other side of the straight and narrow, this ditch, is tradition and the commandments of men, and those things, works as well, works-based salvation. And it's all this manly stuff in a nutshell that are, adding to and taking away and making void the instructions of the Almighty. And so, when people started waking up, I was so excited to start coming into this truth, but my heart was really grieved when I started to see this label of Hebrew roots being thrown around, and I knew as soon as I saw that something was going to be doomed to occur with that label. And you see, a lot of people ended up falling off of the straight and narrow, I think, into another ditch of man, this Judaism and tradition and instructions that do away and make void the instructions of the Almighty. And so we need to be careful. Those are the two ditches. And as far as these Dead Sea Scrolls are concerned and the calendar is concerned, I want to voice my concerns and encourage diligent study, because preliminarily, I'm totally open-minded, but preliminarily, it's almost looking like we have stumbled into a sect of ancient Judaism's tradition, and potentially it was just tradition that they made the calendar to start on a specific day of the week, because we don't explicitly see that in Genesis. There are some assumptions, and it still doesn't work if the solar cycle is 365.2. Like there is some gaps in that reasoning, but we certainly don't see it in Enoch. He does not mention days of the week at all that I'm aware of, but so we need to be careful that it's not just someone's tradition. We're not just falling off the straight and narrow into another ditch of not lawlessness, but tradition. And don't underestimate how much these people may have written. Like I said, I tested some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. A lot of, not just the Dead Sea Scrolls, but a lot of the ancient writings. And I still continually do this, but when I see contradictions, then I guess it's time to kind of dig in a little deeper and say what's going on here. And people, there's just all this information, but we need to, we need to find a way to kind of rightly sort through it. Test it, not just give it free passes because it's ancient. And so, the hate doctrine in the Dead Sea Scroll and the community rule scroll that, all the inhabitants of Qumran seem to ascribe to. There were more copies of that scroll, I believe, found than any other copy of any text. 13 copies. There's more of that than... It was the most popular thing at Qumran, this community scroll, with the hate doctrines and who knows what else. I have actually listened to the full community scroll, and I think there were a few other things when you just listen to it, it's like, But, so, I mean, you gotta test it, and, like, I'll give you a couple examples, like, you know, I tested a lot of the other writings out there, like Enoch 1, Enoch 2, Enoch 3, you know, Baruch, Ezra, there was books like the Book of Adam and Eve, there was something called like the Wisdom of Solomon, I think, and so I just want to give you some thoughts on that, like, when I read, and Jubilees, but, so, like, when I read these things, you know, I took note of the things that jumped out at me, and I still have these notes floating around on my desktop, and they're dated for the day when I made them, but, like, you know, some things just jump out at you, and you don't fully understand the significance, or, you know, it just, but, you know, maybe later on you do, and so, sometimes, well, so these book, the Wisdom of Solomon and the Book of Adam and Eve, take those for example. There are some things, if those are the correct names for the works I'm thinking, you know, the one book was talking about how Adam and Eve died like 20 or 30 times, and the devil just kept killing them and drowning them and burning them and beating them up and all this stuff, and it was like, and at one point there's like this really kind of perverted stuff. It's like an orgy, and it's just not the kind of stuff, you don't see that kind of stuff talked about in that kind of language in the scriptures. And in the Wisdom of Solomon book, it's talking about the demons helping Solomon to build the temple, Solomon's temple, and there's also some perverted language in that too. Like it seems like a dirty mind wrote those books, almost like an ancient tabloid or I don't know, some kind of just dirty mind. Like I mean, you'll just have to read it for yourself, and you'll probably know what I'm talking about when you read the sections of those books. But you know, it's the same kind of sexual perversion that I think you would see. It's the same, I sense the same sexual spirit of perversion that the Pharisees had, a different level of the perversion, but like, for example, you know, it was their doctrine of the day that you could look at a woman and lust after her all you want as long as you didn't commit the physical act. But I mean, it's a heart matter, and it's really a perverted thing. Like, it's really messed up to just, you know, you might, like, I once heard a guy who was, you know, he was waking up to this truth, and he ended up going the Judaism route, and it was sickening to me to hear him try and relate to the carnal guys at work, and he was like, you know, pretty much, he was a married man, but he was allowing himself and joking with people to lust after another woman at work, and it was just, and at one point we got into the conversation, and you know, he was going the route of Yeshua is wrong, and no, that doctrine of looking at a woman, his doctrine of doing the physical act is wrong. And you know, it was just like, well, you know, why don't you just go watch pornography if that's how you feel about that, because that's what it is. Go fill up the measure of that sin. Like, can you not see that's what it is? And so anyway, that's the same kind of spirit that I sense when I read some of these other books. And so, I mean, there are different ways you can test the truth of a book, and some of those books are not small, and like I said, don't underestimate how much men, even ancient men, I mean, nowadays we see people writing so much books and stuff left and right, so don't underestimate that even ancient men could write a lot to try and support their doctrines, or just tell stories, you know, perverted stories, or want to sell their book or whatever. But I mean, so I didn't see anything terrible that sent off warning bells like that necessarily for some other books, like Baruch and Ezra. I mean, someday maybe I'll have to really dive in and try and open up discussion and see what other people think about some of this stuff. But important to the calendar issue and the Dead Sea Scroll stuff, I mean, one of the things is you look around and you see all these other books and it's like, wow, I mean, look, it's 364, it's mentioned in all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's mentioned in all these other books, like the Book of Jubilees and all this stuff, and there's no way that this is wrong, and I just want to put caution and say we should test it. Don't underestimate that these ancient men may have written entire books, like the Book of Jubilees, to support their doctrine, like we see it nowadays, but they had an ability to tell it in a way because they were not so far removed from the history, and they could maybe tell the history with very exact detail. But I'd like to, and I'm not saying all these books are wrong necessarily. I'm very open-minded, but I'm putting caution out there, and I'm saying let's test it, and let's be cautious, and look at the differences, because there are differences, especially on the calendar data. It seems some of all these Dead Sea Scrolls and works are saying one thing, but Enoch says another. Enoch says the first day of the year is simply the day following the spring equinox. All these other books seem to be saying it's got to be on a specific day of the week, like a Wednesday or something. And so as far as testing the Book of Jubilees, I know you've probably all heard a lot about this, and I think 119 Ministries put out a video on that. And I remember the first time I heard 119 Ministries video, I was kind of like, because I think I heard their video at a time when I was really just embracing all of that knowledge, and it was like, oh yeah, this is great. But when I listened to the Book of Jubilees, listened to it like 2 or 3 times, when I really knew nothing and was very open-minded, there was something about the Book of Jubilees. There were some things about the Book of Jubilees that jumped out at me. And the one big thing is, at the end, it throws in this thing about Israel essentially being the Passover lamb. Like the Passover lamb was symbolic for Israel, and not one bone of Israel shall be broken. And it was trying to make this tie, and it's a contradiction. If there's not something going on with the translation, and it's not just something that was kind of inserted in there, if that's part of the homogeneous version of Jubilees, then that, I believe, is a doctrine that contradicts the Messiah. Like, in the New Testament, when, he didn't have a bone of his broken, the New Testament says, there was not a bone of his broken. This fulfills the prophecy that says, not a bone of his shall be broken, not a bone of Israel. And I've heard, truth seekers get really confused about this, and maybe I'm wrong. Like I said, I'm totally open-minded, but the caution, I would like to encourage the caution, because potentially that could explain a lot. Like, there's little tips like that. And what if it is wrong? What if Jubilees is wrong? What if all this, like some of the data, yeah, I'm sure some of it is right. I'm sure the Qumran community, like even the Pharisees had access to Moses and the Torah. It doesn't surprise me that the Qumran community had access to Moses as well, and Enoch. Like, yes, they might have had 11 copies of Enoch, possibly. I mean, they had the Torah too. Like, that doesn't mean that they didn't try to put their own spin or interpretation on it with many other books they wrote. And so we need to test it, and we need to, like, Enoch is the more ancient. So I mean, my theory as far as the calendar goes, and all this said, and like so like that thing about Jubilees, like I was saying, like I'm sure a lot of you have heard that before, like the debates that Judaism has to try and say, Israel is the one fulfilling all this prophecy. and not a bone of Israel shall be broken, all this stuff. But when I read Revelation, I had to ask, because this coworker, my old coworker guy I was telling you about, he was going down this road of falling into the ditch of Judaism. And at one point I asked him, I'm like, well, I mean, if you believe this, because he was questioning all the things in Isaiah about the prophecies of the Messiah, and so excuse me, I'd ask him at one point. I was like, well, I mean, because I knew he was into prophecy too, and I heard him talking about Revelation and stuff. And so at one point, because he wasn't always heading this way, it was a progression, and near the end when he left our firm, he was almost there. And so I mean, it just was a progression, I guess. But I asked, and so I mean, at one point I know he was into prophecy and Revelation, and so at one point when he's starting to talk about not believing Yeshua was the Messiah, I was like, well, I mean, he essentially threw out all the New Testament, and I had to ask him. I'm like, I mean, you have to throw out Revelation too, the Book of Revelation, and the Book of Revelation says, the testimony of Yeshua is the spirit of prophecy, not some man, not some prophets, who has the gift. Like, it says the testimony of Yeshua is the spirit of prophecy, and I think that means he was the only one who could fulfill. He is prophecy being fulfilled, like all these messianic prophecies and all the prophecies of his second coming, and like, he is the spirit of prophecy. He's the only one with the power to fulfill the prophecy. And so, I mean, going back to this Jubilees and this bone of the Passover lamb being broken, I mean, that is one of the big ring, the big 4 or 5 things that they, in Judaism try to say it's Israel that is the Passover lamb, and as opposed to what the scriptures say, they say Yeshua was the Passover lamb, and not a bone of him shall be broken. And so they get potentially tangled up in this stuff, and it's probably because they think it's not possible that such a big book like Jubilees could be wrong. But you've got to be open to the possibility. I'm not saying throw it out the window. It's possible maybe only little sections of it have been altered, but it is also possible that the entire thing was authored by a Pharisaical group who here and there were just inserting the little pieces of doctrine they needed to support their doctrine. And we see that in the Masoretic texts. And I have the Interactive Translation Project where I'm trying to start exposing some of this stuff. But they did not stop at I think even altering the original writings of Moses, like devious. So we have to be careful, and it's not just, I would like to mention, it's not just about testing the information either, but we need to test the spirits too. The spirits that accompany that, and sometimes we can get that from talking to a person who is really passionate about or knowledgeable about this, or picking a strong side one way or the other, or you can tell that right from the reading itself. Like I said, some of those writings that I've seen, are it just seems clear it was a dirty mind that put those writings together. Like, it's just, you don't need to go into that kind of detail unless you have a dirty mind and you want to give that kind of detail. And so, I just want to caution, because my theory of all of this is it's something, people try and put the brakes on this, and they say, don't tell us the theory, come back and tell us when you've got it all figured out. I have to say that's wrong reasoning right there, because I don't claim to have it all figured out, and I don't claim to have the ability to figure it all out. I hope none of us claim to have it all figured out or the ability to figure it all out. Like, we need each other, and one of us has one piece and another has another piece, and when we share and interact and love, then more answers, I think, can come. We can share our pieces. And so, don't put the brakes on what I'm saying because it's not fully thought out. Consider what I'm saying and test these things. Be diligent to test these things. And the possibility is, yes, maybe here and there little pieces of doctrine were added in, and the rest of the book of Jubilees or these other books, for example, are good. The other possibility is the whole thing is been fabricated, and then people look and they're like, oh, but you see, this calendar data matches with all the Jubilees that we read in the book of Jubilees, and yeah, I'll tell you, it probably will, because maybe it was intentionally authored that way, and so I just, the spirits, what Yeshua was dealing with when he was debunking the doctrines of the Pharisees. This stuff could have been put together by a group very similar, and we know it was a group very similar because we see their doctrines. Some of their doctrines were exactly the same as the ones Yeshua debunked, like the hate doctrines. And I'm sure there are others. People have told me there are others. But I mean, I suppose we might as well, at some point test all that stuff. But seeing just one piece of leaven like that is enough to throw caution for me. And I'm not just going to base my, the instructions of the Almighty off of the interpretations of people that have doctrines that Yeshua clearly debunked. Like I said, if there's a contradiction, it requires deeper study, and the contradiction I see is that Enoch does not say anything. Enoch is the oldest on the calendar, and he does not say anything about, he does not seem to say anything about a certain day of the week. And he only says the year begins the day following the spring equinox. And Jerry Morris was under this opinion, put aside that he thought the cycle was still 364, put aside that he was also into the priestly order. When he read Enoch, he read it to say that the first day of the first month is the day following the spring equinox, and the first day of the seventh month is the day following the fall equinox. And I have an audio recording of him saying that I'm going to share just to clarify, because it seems these people have taken, Jerry has now passed, and people have kind of risen up in his place, and they're kind of throwing everything he said about the luminaries out the window. But and then they go on to say, well, yeah, I don't think Enoch says this, but I want to try and encourage people. It's unfortunate, I think, that people are trying to say time is independent from the luminaries. That just seems a direct contradiction to Genesis 1:14. But it is also not in agreement with what Jerry said. And right up until his death, I know Jerry was still interested in the luminaries. Like, I have a message from him a month or two before he passed, where I know he was still looking into the luminary stuff, because he commented on one of my observational videos.
And another thing I'd like to say is that equal day and equal night, and it's specific in Enoch chapter 72, that the day after equal day and equal night is the first of Aviv. The day after the equal day and equal night of the 31st day of the 6th month is the first day of the 7th month. So read Enoch really close before you get a little messed up.
Anyway, a lot of loose ends I gotta try and tie up here, but I just want to encourage everyone to, don't give these writings a free pass, even though there might be a lot of them. This might be a bigger ditch than you think, potentially. You've got to be open to that possibility. Don't give it a free pass. We've got to be diligent. A little leavens the whole lump, potentially. Yeshua was said, beware the leaven of the Pharisees. This group had a doctrine just like the Pharisees. A little piece of calendar leaven can leaven the whole calendar, this having to start on a specific day of the week, and then writing all these books to try and support it. And yes, I know Enoch does say 364, and yeah, all these other books seem to say it, but it's not, don't just judge it by looking at it. I mean, there may be things going on with the translation. Maybe the people who are interpreting the Dead Sea Scroll data just aren't quite getting it the way that the people who wrote that Dead Sea Scroll data originally intended. But I mean, the question has to be asked again, like, why were they putting that data together? Did they lose the understanding of something? Because they never, to my knowledge, never mention anything about the moon moving through the portals, and that's huge. And I have other videos talking about how that's a big confirmation for the year and the month cycle. And so maybe they lost it, and they were trying to find it, and they wrote all these books to support like this 7-day calendar. But as far as Enoch saying 364, we're in the process of trying to verify the translation for that too. And he may have said 364, but or maybe there's something going on translation and it truly is something else, or maybe we're just understanding the application of that wrong. Like, I heard an interesting thought lately. I don't know. I mean, like, if you look at it, I suppose there are only 364 full days in a year, because at the end of the year you've got like 3/4 of a day and 3/4 of a day, so you've only truly got 364 full days. There might be something to that, but I mean, in any situation, I think we can prove this out. It's going to take more time, but I'd just like to throw caution out there. Please look into it. I'm going to be looking into it, but we're out of time now. So I mean, just listen, be diligent, seek out the truth in love. If this isn't speaking to you this time around, we'll keep discussing it. But it just seems like that to me, there is a contradiction. We need to realize there's a contradiction. People try to say there isn't a contradiction, and they read Enoch a different way. But with the witness of, I'm trying to remind people this is not what Jerry Morris thought. And I mean, I don't get that when I read Enoch. So I mean, it seems very dominant. People are saying the luminaries are times are independent, but they're not. I don't think they are. And so, regardless of the cycle, we still have principles in Enoch that about time. Like, it's the book of the courses of the luminaries. It's not the book of number cycles that are independent or calculated from the movements of the luminaries. It's the book of the courses of the luminaries. This book of Enoch. Like, that's the whole purpose. He's talking about their courses, their divisions, their times, their seasons. It has everything to do with the luminaries, not some independent number cycle stuff. So anyway, if this, I pray that we just find truth about this. But we just got to be diligent to look into this stuff. If this speaks to you, I think regardless of the solar cycle being something other than 364, there are some special signs we get on the days of the equinoxes and the solstices, and we know in Genesis 1:14 it says there are signs, and believe me, there are 4 amazing signs that split the year into the 4 seasons, the 4 parts of the year. And I think regardless of the cycle duration a year, those 4 seasons, regardless if it's 364 divided by 4 or 365 divided by 4, regardless of what it is, there are still these signs that split the year cycle. And it is still 4 portions of the year that it splits it into. And the first day of that year cycle is still the first day following the spring equinox, according to Enoch. And the first day of the 7th month is still the first day following the fall equinox. That's the way Enoch seems to have described time. And so there doesn't seem to be a match with this priestly order data, and I'm totally open-minded. I plan on still examining all the information people are sharing, and I'm going to be looking into it diligently for myself, but life just gets busy, and here we are now right before the start of the year, and we need to make a decision. So I've shared this in love, hopefully in humility. I am open. I'm very open-minded, but I have concerns. I see a little leaven, and I'm concerned it's the ditch on the side of the straight and narrow, and a little leaven can potentially leaven the whole lump, and we don't want to be caught up in modern traditions of Judaism or ancient traditions of some kind of branch of Judaism. So there's a lot of other to the point things that I try to address in this series. I talk more about different things, so I encourage you to check them out. Most of the other videos are short videos. Check it out, share your feedback. Iron sharpening iron. I built this channel, and the Facebook groups are in the description below this channel. I made all of this so truth seekers could come together and discuss. I'm not going to moderate what you say or prevent the interaction of truth seekers, only unless someone is truly being satanic or just completely unloving. Just be loving in your communications, and you can discuss whatever you want about the calendar. I'm not going to shut you down just because you totally disagree. That's all I'm going to say for now. I presented this with an open mind. I have concerns, but I do have an open mind. We can resolve these things, or we need, be diligent to prove them out and confirm them. But I guess that's it for now. Shalom, and may Yah bless as you continually seek out truth with a pure heart. In love.